Welcome back! My name is Baller Scuba. This is Video Games Over Time! We are still in 1986, and we are still in Might and Magic. When we last left off, I beat the game. We took our 6 party members that I cheated with and brought them through all the rest of the dungeons of the game, and we were able to beat the game. Not entirely sure what happened. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but we did beat the game. So now it's time to talk about how the game holds up today. And the question I always ask myself first when it comes to modern reviews of the game is, did I have fun? And the answer this time is not really. There were certain aspects of the game that were enjoyable, but I feel like they were largely overshadowed by things that I don't particularly like personally. Kind of a subjective, I just don't like doing that, but also things that just don't age well and most people don't like doing. But before we kind of get into all the things that I think could be improved about this game, let's talk about some of the pros of the game. What are some of the key parts of the game that work well? The biggest thing that stands out to me is the world. There is a large world. We're talking a map with like 15 by 15 square segments, and I believe there's 25 different segments, little sections of the map. So it's a large world map. Then you can factor in all the towns and dungeons, each with 15 by 15 squares in them. There's a lot to explore in this game. That is something that we haven't seen before. I don't think we've seen a world as rich as the Might and Magic world. Pretty much every square has a dungeon or something going on in it. I didn't get a chance to fully explore all of those, but there are tons of dungeons and little mini side quests, I guess you could say. They're not really quests, they're just things that you can explore and kind of find out about this particular area, certain fights or drops or things like that that you can find kind of hidden throughout the entire game. And that is something to be applauded, that there is such a rich, big world for you to explore in the game. In terms of some of the mechanics, I did enjoy the way that you can kind of rest and recover anywhere at any time. Granted, there was a chance that you would get into an encounter, but the fact that you could just rest after the fights, which were difficult, was definitely something that I felt a lot of other games didn't do at the time, so I did appreciate that. The fact that food was not a huge hindrance in this game. We've kind of talked about that before. I'm kind of sick of dealing with food in general in RPGs. So the fact that this did have a system where food existed, it just didn't really matter all that much because you could basically get 40 food for 5 gold pieces per character. So you could get 40 heals with 5 gold pieces, and there were very few dungeons that would require 40 rests. You know, there weren't 40 battles or anything like that. So the balance of you being able to explore, I thought, was good because you could just kind of recover anytime, and that made it easier to just kind of, well, encourage yourself to go out and explore that particular aspect of it. I do appreciate that there were, different classes and races and alignments and 2 genders, and every single thing that you did to create your character had legitimate consequences, right? If you chose a class or a race, it would impact the character's stats and their abilities. The alignments and genders were less impactful, but having male characters in Portsmouth would cause damage. I didn't get a chance to show that off because when I went to Portsmouth, the version of the game that I had was bugged, but what I said was accurate. There were little tiles that, if you stepped on them, would cause damage to your male party members. And there were aspects of the alignments where, you had to have matching alignments for certain spells to work, and then there was certain equipment that we never fully found that would only work on certain alignments. So everything kind of had consequence, and that often does not happen, where sometimes it just kind of feels like, well, it doesn't really matter what class or race I chose for this character. It's not really going to change anything, but in this game it felt much more impactful. So those are some of the things that I kind of enjoyed about the game. I felt that the sounds, they did exist, and that's not always something that games of the time, especially on an Apple II, when we were playing the Apple II version, not every game had sound. So it did have sounds for some key events and, kind of gave you a lot of information on how to deal with everything going on in the game, which doesn't always happen. But it did require a lot of deciphering to get that. Then there were sprites in the game, not too many, and what sprites there were did look good, I thought, but it definitely felt like they didn't always give me the right sprites for the right enemies. But when you could see the sprites, they did look good, and then the world around you, it did look good in terms of kind of like the background, the trees and the dungeon walls and the mountains, all that did look good for the time. With all that said, there were a lot of aspects of the game that I was hoping to be better, I guess would be the best way to phrase it. And when I hope for the game to be better, that I get a little bit more particular. So let's kind of talk about those. That'll be probably a lot of what I talk about here. Like I said, the game, it's not great, but it's not bad. And that's the way that I would put it. It's from a style that no longer applies today overall, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But basically, a lot of the aspects that I'm complaining about were prevalent at the time. This just happened to be an extreme example of it, and I am glad to see those aspects go away. First and foremost, I found the game tedious, and I chose that word kind of carefully. It's not frustrating, it's not boring, it's just tedious. And this is coming from somebody that did not end up doing any mapping and basically cheated to get around the level grinding towards the end. I would argue that probably about at least 95% of what you do in this game is either drawing maps and exploring, trying to figure out all the different parts of town and the world and stuff like that, and level grinding. Those are the two main aspects of the game. So if you enjoy doing those, if you like drawing the maps and trying to explore every little nook and cranny of the game, then this game does have a lot to offer for you. I have never mapped, and I hope to never actually map a game. It's just not what I enjoy doing. I don't get into RPGs for cartography, basically. But if you do enjoy that, then this game will be fun for you because that's most of what you're going to be doing. But the fact that there was so much going on that didn't ultimately matter for the main plot, because at some point I said, okay, I'm not having fun doing all the exploring, even though there is stuff for me to find. A lot of stuff that would have impacted the gameplay. Apparently there's a fountain that you can hit that'll give you a random stat up to 30. And then there's a bug that you can do where you bump into something else and then go back to the fountain and it'll recharge. So you can get your entire party's stats up to 30, but only for one battle. There's a lot of things like that going on. There are ways to legitimately increase your stats permanently. I think it was 2 every time you used it. There were fountains that I think did that permanently, but the guides that I found were less than clear about where those were and how to get there. So I didn't bother looking for them, but yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But overall, the game was mostly level grinding. Even though there was a rich world to explore, a lot of it wasn't going to help when it came to powering up your party. And the game doesn't feel balanced as a result of that. There were huge spikes in difficulty, right? Between between different sections of the map, which I understand to some extent, but there was not really a warning. And then with the limited save, it just kind of felt like the game was going to make you die several times. And that's kind of how the game focuses and eats up some time, which is typically seen as a good thing at the time. If the game takes you hundreds of hours to beat, that's a better game than a game that only took you 10 hours to beat, right? That was the mindset. But the way that this game goes about kind of lengthening it, it just kind of felt like without me mapping every little nook and cranny of the world, that I was almost being punished and not giving the experience and the equipment that I was going to need. Equipment basically was so reliant on the fighting and random chest drops, because not every fight gives you a chest, and not every chest gives you an item, and not every item is going to be the one that is useful for you. And that was the only way to get stronger past like maybe level 6 or 7 when you could start affording everything that was available in town. And like I showed, like level 20 wasn't enough to beat the game. So you kind of had to rely on random drops in order to level up your party. And I'm not always a fan of that. I would much rather have a town that gives me an upgrade. But the way that this game works, it's an open world and you can kind of explore everywhere, but then there's always going to be something that stops you and you have no idea where those are going to be. The party members, I would argue, are not balanced. There were definitely party members that were much more useful than others, particularly the robber ended up being damn near useless to me in a fight. And really, I kept Brody around in order to open up treasure chests and unlock doors, and that's it. I felt like there should have been a way to make Brody useful in a fight. I gave him the crossbow, hoping that, because he wasn't in the melee range too often, that it was going to allow him to do damage. But once you hit a certain point of the game, nothing he did would have done damage, as far as I can tell. The fighters, they took a long time to get useful. Basically, until you hit level 8, they weren't particularly useful. They were just kind of there. I don't know. It just all felt a little off. And then certain magics weren't useful, so the mages only had certain points where they were super useful, and then other points where they weren't. I would love a much more balanced party where it felt like not only does each character have a role, which I feel like they do in this game, but that role was useful. And there were definitely several points where it felt like several party members were just kind of there to take a hit and preserve the life of other more useful party members. Speaking of battling, I felt that the battles were too long for what they were, considering there's no animations, there's not even a sprite on screen, it's all text-based. I felt like the battles should have been shorter, especially since there were very few ways for me to deal damage effectively. Sure, our front line, our warrior and our knight and our paladin, I believe are their official names, they could deal a good amount of damage, and our archer could as well once they started getting to the higher levels. They can hit multiple times, but they could only hit one enemy, and you can have upwards of like 15 enemies, I think was the max. I think it goes to O, so like A through O. It's way too many enemies for me not to have an effective multi-targeting spell. And there weren't really any effective multi-targeting spells. There were a couple spells that would hit everybody, but they weren't really effective, right? I'm at the end of the game and I can do like 1 to 10 points of damage using my cleric on the entire enemy party. And then, the But that was only when I was outside. That was another thing, that the most effective spells were only useful outside. If you were in a dungeon, they were useless to you. They just didn't work. And those were often the only multi-targeting spells. I think there was only one effective spell, but it only hit 3 of the enemies. And maybe I should be using buffs and debuffs and stuff like that more often. But ultimately, that's just prolonging a fight that I already felt was too long. I want to be able to do lots of damage to everybody and not care about the costs. The fights, they just went on too long because I didn't have a way of dealing with a large group, and almost every fight was a large group. It was... I can't even think of a time that we only encountered 1 or 2 monsters. It was always, 5 to 10, right? It was always kind of this large group that just, okay, let's go through all of this. I can tackle them one at a time. It just took too long, and honestly, the rewards were often not worth it, even though that seemed to be the only way to get level grinding done. To get the proper experience, it almost all had to be through fighting. But yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But when it comes to the actual fighting, randomness, not just the fighting, the whole game, I would say, the randomness in the game was far too high. It relied so much on this random number generator, right? For my strongest attack, my strongest magical attack, which once again could only be used outdoors, to deal from 1 to 120 points of damage. That is an insane range. And I know this is based on Dungeons and Dragons, which is more random than I would like. Even for a Dungeons and Dragons game, 1 to 120 points of damage is far too big of a range. Like, I would accept maybe like 60 to 120, but this game goes all the way down to 1. I shouldn't have a spell that can one-shot any enemy in the game, also deal nothing just based on a random roll of the dice, or at least feel like nothing. 1 point feels like nothing. I feel like 60 to 100 is a lot better. Okay, so there is a range, but this is going to be effective no matter what. So the ways that spells worked in the game and damage worked in the game, far too random for me, but also the fact that the only way to get some of the items that you needed to beat the game, like gems or even some of the keys were random. They all came from random drops. Like, everything was random drops. So if you wanted to use your powerful spells, you had to get into fights and hope for drops. And granted, there was definitely some points where I was gaining gems. There were also points, especially when I was level grinding on the wyverns, which took me like 8 hours, I was losing gems because the wyverns don't drop gems, at least very often. So that meant I would have had to find a different spot to level grind in order to get gems so that I could level grind fully and get the experience from the wyverns. It's just not balanced. It's far too random. That I didn't appreciate. Another thing when it came to kind of progressing through the game, almost everything important was hidden behind a fake wall. Pretty much everything. To even get started with the first quest of the game, you would have to go through a hidden wall. Like, that to me was too much, where it's just everything. I don't mind it every once in a while, especially if they've kind of already introduced the concept to you, but this game doesn't really introduce it to you. They just kind of expect you to know, oh, there's hidden walls everywhere. And if you look at the world map, over half of the walls on the world map, be it trees or mountains or tall grass, whatever you want to call it, over half of those are fake, and you can walk through them. And I think that's far too much. It just kind of feels like, what's the point of even having a wall if half of them are going to be fake? So that's just progression thing for me, and that one's more my personal taste. I feel like the other stuff is just kind of like, 1 to 120 points of damage. That's not a good range for an attack. Just objectively, but the fake walls, that one's probably mine. I also would say that the balance of progression in the game is way too far off. They have huge spikes in difficulty. I did actually look up a speed run of the game, and you can actually do the game if you're incredibly lucky. Once again, randomness is key. If you get really lucky, you can beat the game in less than 10 minutes. Because you can just go here and just never get into fights along the way. But if you do get into a fight, you're screwed. And that's where things really got to me. That I spent, I probably spent a total of 200 hours working on this game and this series. You guys probably saw about 8 hours of it total. But I probably spent 150 to 200 hours, somewhere in that range, working on the game, trying to figure out what do I do, what guides can I look at, and what do I need to do to progress. And that's how I ended up doing 3 different versions of the game in this one series. I did not like doing it. I'm not necessarily proud of how this series turned out, simply because I didn't have the information that I normally do in an RPG. And although that has happened before, it's never been to this extent where the guides would basically just tell me, like, go to A2 and fight the dragons. Basically, that was it. End of story. Fight the dragons. And I was just supposed to know where they were or go find them myself. And that made things difficult, so I would have to re-record and do all that kind of stuff. But the biggest thing for me was that once I decided, okay, we're just going to go through the main quest, and I'm going to get experience, and hopefully it'll be enough to get me through, I got capped at, I think I was only like level 5, maybe 6, when just hard stop. There's no way I'm going to be able to do this without level grinding. And I think it took me about 8 hours to get up to level 9, just fighting the wyverns, which I was told was the most cost-effective and time-effective way. And after doing that, I was only able to progress about 15 minutes further in the game. That was not fun. And then I had to look at it and go, okay, what is it going to take for me to get to the next spot, which was, I assumed somewhere around level 20. It turned out that was a low number. But to get from, like 5 or 6 to 9 took me 8 hours. What was it going to take for me to get from 9 to 20? Right, we're talking dozens and dozens of hours, and I just couldn't do it. So I had to cheat. And I don't necessarily want to use this as a reasoning or an excuse as to why I did it, but that just kind of shows what kind of huge spike in difficulty the game does have. That I spent 8 hours doing what I was told was the fastest way to get something done, and it wasn't enough, and I was looking at easily 4 times as long to actually get where I needed to go. Even if I got to the point where I could take on the dragons more effectively, it was still going to just take so much time to get up to the level and just the power that I was going to need just to progress with the game. And I feel like the game did expect me to do the side quests. And this is where I kind of want to talk about the side quests, because I largely ignored them. We showed off a couple, right, where I turned in the herbs to one of the kings, or the one where I delivered the mail to like the 3 towns over and over and over again. The reason that I didn't do it is because the guides that I found said that it wasn't time effective, it wasn't cost effective to do that. And what ended up happening is I would look up, okay, how much experience do you get from it? And even for the highest level side quest to help out these kings or the things in town, the most experience that you would get for doing it was 10,000. And although that sounds like a good number and it was more than one fight, a lot of those highest level side quests for 10,000, you would probably get more completing the actual quest than you would from the reward from the quest. A lot of them involved killing certain monsters and getting items from them. And those fights, getting there and defeating those enemies, were probably going to give you more experience than actually turning the quest in. And most of them were in like the 1,000 to 2,500 experience range, which was nothing. That's what we were getting from the Wyverns. So by the time that I had hit levels, 6 to 8, somewhere in there, the side quests basically were not useful for me in terms of experience. It wasn't worth the time. I was getting more experience just fighting enemies. So those were, although the world was full, it didn't reward you enough to explore it. It just was kind of there in my mind. So even though there were all these little nooks and crannies and all these little side quests that you could do, the fact that it just didn't seem worth it to go through all that hassle kind of detracts from the world itself. And that's too bad, I would say, because I wanted to like the game. But basically, yeah, the side quests were just not worth it. So I ended up avoiding them and just trying to focus on this is what I need to do to beat the game. I guess we'll talk a little bit more about the technical aspects of it, and then I'll kind of return to the plot. But the graphics, although I did like them, there weren't a lot of them, and they were probably lower than other games of the time. Look at The Bard's Tale, look at some of the Ultima games. The Wizardry games, they were better than the Wizardry originals, but not necessarily the remakes that have come out by this point. The other computer versions, ultimately it wasn't as good. Although they were good, they weren't as good as the competition. And then sounds, not the first time I've said this, they became annoying. Especially the DOS version, I almost immediately muted it anytime I booted up the game. Just let's turn this sound off. I do appreciate a jingle when you defeat enemies and win a battle, but how quickly you could defeat enemies in this game just made it so repetitive and so quickly, especially considering how many you need to kill, that it's never a good sign when I turn off the sound to your game, because I feel like that's going to be better for me, but definitely happened this time. And then finally, when it comes to RPGs, my favorite part is the plot. And so I will discuss the plot a little bit. Not that there's a lot to discuss. The plot did seem out of nowhere, right? We snuck our way, like the main quest all happened in the last video, it felt like to me. We spent the first 7-8 videos just gathering keys for the rest of the game. But once we had all the keys, we just kind of rushed through all the last dungeon. So the plot felt very rushed in at the end. So let's try to sum it up quickly. We went to Castle Doom, and in Castle Doom, or I'm just going to call it a castle, but in Doom, we found the real King Alamar. And the real King Alamar told us we had to get rid of the fake King Alamar, so we went to Castle Alamar. And when we went to Castle Alamar, we confronted the fake king, and he sent us to, I think they called the Soul Realm. I'm not entirely sure what it was called. It's not coming to me right now. But, he sent us to another realm. And there an alien told us that we needed to give him his name. It wasn't Rumpelstiltskin, it was Sheltem. But once we got his name done, we got warped out of the Soul Realm. And once we were done with that, that opened up the way for us to go into kind of like a more ethereal, arcane style dungeon, right? That was more magic based as opposed to the Soul one, or the Astral Plane is what they called it. And on the Astral Plane, even though we had just talked to an alien, in the astral plane, we opened up a few doors, and that led us to, I assume, the creator of Might and Magic, who basically congratulated us for making it that far and told us to get ready to go to the second game, which was just more or less a random part of the map where there was a spot for you to go, but it wouldn't let you go until you got the second game. And that was basically it. Whether we actually rescued King Alamar does not seem to be important. Who the alien is does not seem to be important. So yeah, the plot is just kind of strange and almost pushed in. It's not the first time that we've dealt with this kind of magical world and then kind of, wait, it turns out it's space. And also not the first time that we've dealt with, oh, let's break the fourth wall and acknowledge that you're playing a game. But both times just kind of felt odd. The game does suffer from a lack of big enemies, a lack of reasons to push forward other than exploration. There's not really a lot to the game in terms of why you're doing it, why you're pushing forward, why you're trying to defeat any of the monsters, trying to solve any of the quests. You're just kind of exploring and, oh, I guess I'll do that. And one of them turns out to be a main quest, basically. So the game lacks a lot of attention to detail, I would say, overall. It's got a great premise, and I think there's a lot to like about the game if it's a style that you like. If you are a big fan of mapping out things, going very slow, having tons of papers around you for reference, because it's not only going to be the maps, you also need to know what quests you're doing, write down notes as you go, because you're going to get small little clues, right? Like the gypsy will tell you what your horoscope is, and if you don't have it written down, and maybe you, like, because it was so close to the first town, let's say you went to the gypsy, within 15 minutes, and you're just like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then like 10 hours later, you get to the point where they quiz you on your horoscopes. You could lose your entire party because you didn't write it down. So you have to have those notes. You have to have the manual in front of you, especially to cast the spells. You have to have the maps in front of you at all times. And I was going through, I think, 5 different tabs of all the different types of maps that I needed to keep track of. I think I had 14 or 15 tabs open every time I was playing it. So in case you were wondering, why is it taking them so long to scroll through things? Because it was so scattered. And so if that does not sound fun to you, then this game does not have a lot to offer you. There are certain aspects that are fun, but there are much better examples of games that do it, but do it better. And from a modern perspective, it was so incredibly difficult for me to find good information about this game. Like I said, I probably spent somewhere in the range of 150 to 200 hours not only playing, but doing research on the game. I could not find information that I wanted, and I'm used to getting for other RPGs. And the most comprehensive guides that I could find would often not tell me the information that I actually needed to use, or would give me bad information. They would, the best one that I found basically just told me, go to this area and go into the dungeon. And I'm like, okay, but where's the dungeon? And then, so there was a lot of cross-referencing that I would have to do to get through the game. So this game, it was not particularly enjoyable for me, but a lot of that does have to do with the fact that I'm trying to be entertaining, and this game does not always allow for that. The game does not have an audience in mind. It is just between the player and the computer, and in order to try to speed things up for you guys, I had to skip certain things because I didn't feel like you guys were going to be interested in watching me take a step, check every wall, make notes, and make a map on the side, and then end up doing a ton of level grinding. Just like I said, I spent probably 8 hours just on those wyverns, and I was looking at probably another 30 to 40 hours This game almost became a job by the time I was done. So it's just not built for an audience watching somebody play. It's not an arcade game. It's a computer game, and it does act that way. And from a modern perspective, we would call a lot of its gameplay today a lack of quality of life improvements, is the phrase that is often thrown around. The fact that we don't have a map. Well, a map is a quality of life improvement compared to what was going on at the time. And stuff like that is happens all the time. The fact that they don't tell you whether equipment goes up or down, which is a common thing, whether equipment makes you better or worse, that's common, but it's just another thing. And it's an extreme example of a lot of the issues that I have with computer RPGs at the time, but this one cranked it up. And so this one was a struggle for me. So would I recommend it to a modern audience? The answer is absolutely not. If you are interested in a game where you have to take your time and you need to basically solve everything in the game, including how to proceed, where to go, what to do, and basically have to draw a map every step of the way. If that sounds fun to you, then this game will have something for you. Otherwise, this game can be easily skipped. And I think for most people, this game is easily skipped. And that's my modern take on the game. When the game was released, it was fairly popular. Might and Magic sold over 100,000 copies by 1989. Critics at the time had relatively positive reviews for the game. The scope of the game, its non-linear gameplay, and the graphics were praised. However, the game's initial difficulty and lack of animations were occasionally criticized. As time has gone on, the game has retained a positive reputation. More modern critics have praised the game for its scope, its freedom, and some of its gameplay innovations. Might and Magic would see ports and sequels. We will keep an eye on many of these as we continue. As for John Van Caneghem and New World Computing, Might and Magic would not be the final game they would make. We will hear from both of them again in the future as well. That will do it for the story of Might and Magic for now. My name is Baller Scuba. This has been Video Games Over Time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in our next video when we go over some honorable mentions of 1986.